I think we can get it started. So, good afternoon to everybody. I'm very happy to present this Three Voices seminar entitled Visions of Urban Landscapes, with which we are going to conclude our small cycle of lectures within this course dedicated to images, imaginaries, and representations of landscape meant as cultural constructs which are able to affect actual transformations and to take, let's say, active part in shaping reality. We dedicated 2 lectures and the introductory lecture of this course to this topic. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to focus on this topic with all these wonderful friends and guests. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest speakers of today, Michele Nastasi, Davide Tommaso Ferrando, and Claudia Mainardi, which are connected from Rotterdam, Milan, and several places. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation, for being with us today. I'm very happy to also to create this, maybe this to join you, because some of them didn't know each other before. And so we will focus specifically today on urban landscapes and images, and we will do it through these 2 lectures based, freely inspired, we can say, on by 2 researches conducted respectively by Michele and Davide. So from 2 very different disciplinary perspectives, but that in my opinion are deeply intertwined one with each other on different levels. And so I would like, I expect today that today these common features would emerge from this dialogue. And so I will tell maybe a few words on these researches. On one side, we're going to tackle Michele's photographic research on some of the main cities of the Arabian Peninsula, which you see here, the cover of this presentation, Arabian Transfer, because this research led recently, actually in 2021, so this year, to the publication of this book with Atje Kans. And on Davide's investigation on the central role played by urban images and imaginaries in shaping, let's say, the processes which through which our cities are being perceived, transformed, say, understood, and especially built at the end of the day, which also led to a publication that is called The City in the Image. This book, published in 2018 by Vibok Works. So I don't want to anticipate too much the contents of the lectures, because we will have plenty of times for the final debate, which will be led and moderated by Claudia Mainardi. And so I will really be encouraging all of you to participate actively in the debate, to ask questions, to make comments, and to take the most out of the presence of our guest today. Before leaving the floor to Michele, which will be starting with this lecture, I would like to tell a few words on their profiles, of course. So Michele Nastasi is a photographer and a researcher in the field of architecture, cities, and their representation. He holds a PhD in the history of the arts from Ca' Foscari, Venice, and taught architectural photography in different universities, among which the Politecnico di Milano as well. As part of his research activity, he has curated several exhibitions, among which I would like to mention the exhibition called Luigi Ghirri, Il paesaggio dell'architettura. We talked about Ghirri in the last lecture, and that was held at Triennale di Milano in 2018, focusing on the relations between Ghirri and Lotus International magazine, for which Michele has been an editor for almost more than a decade, I guess, and I had the opportunity to work with him in the editorial staff of Lotus. So his pictures and writings are published on major international reviews and journals, and he's author of several essays and books, among which this last, Arabian Transfer, that he's going to present, which collects photos taken between 2010 and 2017, correct me if I'm wrong, within a wider research on the Arabian Peninsula, and on spectacular architecture in general in the Gulf, highlighting this transitionary condition of these 6 cities that are Abu Dhabi, Doha, Dubai, Kuwait City, Manama, and Riyadh, representing them as places of passage for cultures and people, and in a way as a sort of laboratory of the global contemporary conditions of our cities. Davide Tommaso Ferrando is an architectural researcher, critic, and curator. He is particularly interested in the intersections between architecture, city, and media. He holds a Master of Architecture in Advanced Architectural Design at ETSA Madrid and a PhD in Architecture and Building Design at Politecnico di Torino. He has been working and collaborating with several academic institutions, and he currently is a research fellow at the Faculty of Design and Art of the Free University of Bozen, as well as adjunct professor at the Faculty of Architecture of the University of Innsbruck. Director of Viceversa Bits and of 011 più, I tell it in Italian, I hope it's okay, and editor of Realismo Utopico. His writings are published also in international magazines such as the Architectural Review, Log, Casabella, and Volume, as well as in collective books. And together with Daniel Tudor Munteanu, I hope the pronunciation is nice, is founder and curator of the Unfolding Pavilion, which is taking place within the Venice Biennale, and also curator of several exhibitions in the field of architecture. And in 2018, as I told you, we published this book, The City in the Image, with Big Bookworks, that is exploring this relationship between the sometimes brutal recent transformations of urban and suburban realms, landscapes, under the pressure of financial urbanism and the codification of the city in Western cultural visual memory. So I think he will make a super synthesis of the 3 super interesting chapters of his book. Okay, last but not least, Claudia Mainardi is an architect and doctoral student at Politecnico di Milano, where she is actually part of the Marie Curie Horizon to 2020 project, TAC, Communities of Tacit Knowledge, Architecture and Its Ways of Knowing, coordinated by the ETH in Zurich. And in this framework, she is currently working to a thesis that she's very careful to say that the title is a tentative in-progress title, but actually the title would be Critical Practices in the 21st Century Post-Austerity Times, Tacit Processes of Architectural Codification between Biennales and the Everyday. She has been working previously for several prestigious architecture firms, including OMA, AMO, Embriere DV, Stefano Boeri, Studio Folder, with whom she won the special mention at the 14th Venice Biennale. And she has been teaching assistant at Politecnico di Milano, a researcher at the Y Factory, the think tank led by Winnie Maas within TU Delft, and a collaborator at the Het Nieuwe Institute in Rotterdam. She has curated and participated to the curatorship of several architecture exhibitions, and since 2013 she is partner of the architectural design and research collective Fosbury Architecture. So, of course, after the first presentation, as usual, we will make a small break of 10 minutes to give you the possibility to take a break. But now I would like to leave the floor to Michele, and thank you very much. So I mute myself, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me clearly? Yes?
Yes, very clearly.
Good. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be somehow back at the Politecnico after a few years. In the next 45, 50, 52 minutes, I'm going to present a series of pictures and a book called Arabian Transfer that derives from, as Gaia said, more than 10 years of work, of research on architecture and some of the urban themes and urban development in the Gulf cities. The Gulf is the Persian Gulf, or as the Arabic people say, the Arabic Gulf. This series is, first of all, a personal journey through 6 cities. So the cities are Abu Dhabi and Dubai in the Emirates, Doha in Qatar, Kuwait City in Kuwait, Manama in Bahrain, and Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. These cities are, in my opinion, essentially invisible as real places, despite being represented continuously by the media, by advertising, by tourism. And so this book and the images I'm going to show try to fill this void of representation, which is a void loaded with different meanings, with cultural, with social, and, and political implications. Let's start from the cover image, which is very important to me because it somehow generated the whole book and a whole series and some years of reflections about not only the city, but also the role that my work can play in the comprehension, in the understanding of these places. I firstly landed in Abu Dhabi in 2010, and then I went back several times, including very recently for the Dubai Expo. Because I'm interested in photography, in architectural photography, and I was doing some researches on iconic buildings and iconic architecture in the Gulf states. This image was taken because I was shooting the tallest building of the world, which is visible only in part here in the right part of the skyline, which is the Burj Khalifa. It's more than 800 meters tall. And after a few days of shooting, I was very tired of what I saw at the foot of the building. So I looked for a less central place from which I could photograph it. So I took a taxi and I started to ride around the city and I found this place, which is called Satwa, and I got out. And Satwa is an interesting neighborhood because it's completely different from the usual habitual imagery that we have of Dubai, of like shiny streets and shiny buildings. It's made of low and ordinary buildings. There are scenes of everyday life. You can smell the food cooked on the grills. And in a few hundred meters, I found myself in the sand where people, men, have taken possession of the city space by playing cricket. I came here several times. The first time was 2012. Then I shoot this picture in 2015 because I think that going back to places can be sometimes very relevant for research. So seeing how places are modified in the years. And so I came here on Friday because I knew that in Friday afternoon, workers come here and they gather here to to play, to stay together and to play cricket and soccer. I think it's an interesting image also because it kind of contrasts the city on the background with the people who built the city but do not inhabit the city. So there is a sort of separation in between the city and the inhabitants of the city. I think that the game, the fact that they are playing games and their movements, the elegance of their clothing make everything a bit easier to take in because, of course, many of the scenes that one can see in Gulf cities are not particularly friendly or not particularly easy to digest. Of course, I started speaking about architectural photography, and some of you may wonder if this is a picture of architecture or not. I think it is a picture of architecture, but I also think that the conventions of architectural photography have always seemed very tight to me, to my eyes. So I don't particularly like when the building is represented as a still life, as an abstract object, and impoverished of all the aspects that are not strictly related to architectural design. Of course, the approach of a photo shooting for a photographer depends much on the purposes that he has. It depends also on the clients who can commission some pictures. But in general, to me, buildings are much more meaningful when they are shown in relation to what we can call the context where the building is, which is a context which is not only physical, but it's also in broader terms, geographical, historical, and social. So it's particularly interesting to think about this kind of representation in the Gulf, because in the last, let's say, at least 20 years, there was a big trend to abstraction in these places, especially in Dubai. So architectural projects were mostly represented in renderings and in photographs as abstract, hyper-formal exercises arranged on a tabula rasa. The tabula rasa is in itself an abstraction, something that doesn't really exist, because it's actually made of something. It's made of sand, it's made of dirt, of concrete, and it's still something I can photograph, for example. So for all these reasons, more than a group of architectural photographs in strict terms, this series that I'm going to show is conceived as a journey and as a personal experience that I had of these places and an encounters with their inhabitants. This is a picture that I shoot in Dubai. We are on the beach of Marina. It's a neighborhood in Dubai. And it's the opening picture of the book, which is very important to me, because when I started thinking about the concept of Arabian transfer, I had in mind places like that, the beaches of Dubai. Because these are places where you can, in a glimpse of an eye, notice the great diversity of the people and the diversity of their behaviors. It's important to note that in Dubai, in general, in the Gulf states, the rate of immigration is very high. In Dubai, it reaches 92% of immigrants from all over the world, while in Europe, the average is lower than 10%, and it is 15% in the United States. So if Dubai is 91%, Italy is 9%. So it's the numbers are on reverse. And so when you spend some time in Dubai, or when I spend time there, and I start walking in the places and look around, I feel part of something new, a new melting pot, different from that of all the other, let's call them world-class cities that I know in the West. And in the Gulf, I experience a living and very controversial and social and political laboratory, where the identity and the ambition of the emirs and of the sheikhs confront the models that come from the West, and the variety of all the different cultures that the inhabitants, the immigrants bring to these places. So transfer, first of all, the transfer of the title is a concept that refers to the idea that these cities can exist today in their current form as we see and we experience them today, thanks to a transfer of people, first of all, but also culture, capitals, goods, and images with which move steadily from one place of the world to another. This is an image of Kuwait City in a very central area of Kuwait, where you can see a lot of different aspects of the city that come together in one image, kind of collapse. I like the compresence of different things, and I see a big number of things that are, in my opinion, a transfer. Of course, what you see more, it's what you see on the foreground is this group of workers. It's the time of the day where the laborers change the shifts. So they end their shift and there's new people coming. And you see skyscrapers designed by Western design studios. The one on the left is by Norman Foster. The one on the right is by SOM. You see the traffic as in every city of the world. You see, restaurants. You see that there is a Dior big advertisement on the wall of a mall. So there is much to see that tells about things that are moving from one place to another, and that they arrive here and then they go somewhere else. So the transfer is referring both to the idea of moving continuously, but also to a place of transit that exists like in airports. So the idea of a transit is a place where travelers can spend some time, but which can never be a final destination. So you can spend 30 years in some of the Gulf states without being able to become a citizen. So it's an interesting point of reflection, because Gulf countries are inhabited and mostly built by short or long-term immigrants from all over the world, like me, a short traveler, and like these people that stay for longer time. But the majority of the people living there are absolutely unable to become citizens of these places. Then there is a third aspect that I am referring to, which is a more literal and literally term, which is the term transfer refers to Manhattan Transfer, which is a novel, a great novel by John Dos Passos, an American writer, that published a book in 1925 that tells the lives of a number of characters. In the background of them, there is the skyline of Manhattan rising at the beginning of the last century. It's a great novel, which I recommend all of you to read if you want to feel the sense of restlessness of the modern city. And it's something I had in mind while I was editing this work. So in particular, this image seems to be, referring to that piece of literature. And there is a part where Dos Passos describes the materials of the skyscrapers, and somehow it seems that he foresaw something of what could happen in Dubai 1 century later. Of course, the skyline is an obsession to many cities, in particular to the Gulf cities. We all have in mind the images of stacks of skyscrapers. And of course, it's an image that derives from the West. And so therefore, there is another level of transfer, which is the image of the city itself. But in general, in this series, I have avoided the sensational and abstract character of most urban photography, where the city is depicted from far without signs of life, just as as a sculptural and very iconic thing. In general, I prefer to walk in the streets, even if sometimes I risk my life because the streets are not made for walking in those places. And to find a more direct and close, intimate relationship with the city and with their mostly anonymous inhabitants, also without trying to hide the harshness of the life of these cities and of their landscapes. So, for example, if you walk in places like Riyadh in Saudi, you can find yourself in situations which are, unusual and enigmatic. I came here at least 20, let's say 15 times, because I wanted to shoot what you see on the background of this photograph, which is a wall, enormous neighborhood made mostly of skyscraper, very strange and let's say exuberant forms. And I was looking for the right spot and the right time of the day with the best light. And I wasn't convinced of what I was doing, but at a certain moment, something happened. This guy came, and I shot this image almost by error, by mistake. Then it came out that that was the best picture, because something happens sometimes in photography. It's what happens by accident. Of course, you have to be able to create those accidents, to be ready. And this is an interesting picture because it shows different things of this place, but also because I don't know if this guy actually used the computer to shade himself from the sun because it was very hot, or because he didn't want to be photographed, at least in his face, because privacy is an obsession for Saudis, and they really don't want them to be seen in photography. This is a shot I made from the ground level, which is, I think, very important, a place where it's very important to stay. But of course, it would have been completely different to shoot Riyadh from the top. This picture is not included in the book, but it's something I shot because of my researches, and you can see that the city is completely different. It's a way of representing urbanity, which somehow doesn't match with that, or shows different things. Here I was on the top of one of those towers that you can see here. And once again, it would be very different to show Riyadh, for example, in the night. So this is an image of Riyadh, and it's taken in the evening, where the city changes its face, and the appearance is much more spectacular and promotional, and it resembles to other places in the world and also in the Gulf. So, for example, this is an image. All these images taken from a higher point of view, a high point of view, vantage point, are not included in the book. But I'm including this in this presentation, trying to, to keep an eye on the architectural usual representation, urban representation. This is a typical image of Dubai, taken before dusk. You see the main street where all the big skyscrapers of Dubai are aligned. And of course, this is not so far from was taken in a place which is not so far from the place where I shot the picture that's on the cover of the book. On the contrary, if you spend some time in the streets, this is the same street, and you have time, and you take your time, you will see a lot of other things. You will see that there is traffic, there is, of course, architecture, but from very close, you will see the people. So one day I spent some half an hour, 40 minutes in this spot, looking at people that were waiting for an elevator to go on a lower level of Sheikh Zayed Road, which is the name of this 14 lanes road in the center of Dubai. And yeah, when you shoot and then you look at images, you find interesting things. Indians, or I don't know exactly from which part of South Asia these people come from. Maybe Pakistan or Bangladesh, I'm not sure. Africans, and a lot of other people. So sometimes I shoot a lot of images, and then I don't look at the folder for a lot, because I want to forget about what I did. And this enables me to be more detached from my own work, as I was a third person when I edit my work. So time is a very important element of photography, and an element that is important to think about when you edit a series of photographs. This is another example. We are very close to the previous image. It's a public place that was created 4 years ago in Dubai. It became very popular because all attractions draw in flows of people, curious, groups of friends, families, and everyone photographs themselves smiling. Because of course, photography is an activity that everybody do, and they all like it, and we all like it. So sometimes I think of the Gulf as the result of an exodus of rich and poor people from all over the world, a sort of funnel through which a lot of people, especially from the densely populated countries of Asia. You have to think that India is only 3 hours away by flight. These countries empty out to fill these places, to build and inhabit these desert cities of the Arabian Peninsula. So you will always see when you travel here people taking pictures and talking on the phone at all times of the day, of the night, in all the places, in the cars, wherever, because they try to keep touch with their own families, which are in their countries, in the original countries. And of course, it's sometimes a very difficult situation because most of these immigrants are men that leave their family for a long time and who suffer this, this distance. So you will see them smiling, but it's not always so easy. The reason because these people travel, of course, is the most obvious. So it's need for work, need for money. But somehow, with all the shortcomings and contradictions of these places, Gulf cities can be also an opportunity for a better life and a safe haven, because many people come from places which are in war and where they risk their life every day. I insist a little bit on this idea of the people that you can see, of the workers and what they do, because basically we all go there for work, or most of us go there for work. This is an image I shot in Abu Dhabi when I was photographing a cluster of buildings. And it's a very simple image that shows something seen which is very common, but at the same time, you never see in the representation of these cities. The idea is that all skyscrapers need to be cleaned, especially if you are in the desert and where it hardly ever rains, and the frequent sandstorms leave the curtain wall covered with a patina of sand. So the effort required to keep the buildings and the streets clean, and more generally to preserve everything from the corrosion of the desert, is immense. And so immense is the need for people that come for work. But of course, there is not only labor, there is also, a number of very strange and funny things going on. This picture is emblematic because it shows the sky slope in Dubai, which I visited in 2010 for the first time. It was the month was April. Outside, the temperature was about 35 degrees, and inside, of course, it was 18 inside of this mall. But inside the slope, you can see there is a thermometer that says that the temperature is -3. So I sat here looking at what was going on. There is a sushi bar, And then I stopped into a sort of mountain cafe, which is called the St. Moritz Cafe, to drink a hot tea because it was too cold. All the experience is more than crazy. It's you know, an excess of postmodernity, of course, but at the same time, it's very interesting because this is possible because Dubai, it's really a place of global transit. There is a lot of people coming here, and they want to have this opportunity to to ski. And so these cities, Dubai more than others, but in general, are a perfect representation of the contemporary world's state of transience. The idea that, behaviors, pieces of cultures, people move from one place to the others, to one place to the other. And these are places where I also perceive something of myself. So it's not a matter of the other people. It's a matter of being part of these people. Of course, I don't go skiing here. I just come and look, but I'm part of that. And I perceive, something of my life, my own life, especially because as a photographer, I travel and I visit many, many places. So this is a condition of transience, which I think identifies the being of my generation more than of any other that preceded me and my generation. So I insist on a personal level of engagement with these places, because I think it's the only way for a photographer to find a reason and a grip that will allow him to say something personal and important about a place. So this, I'm talking about global transfer, of impermanence, of course, exaggeration, as Ski Dubai clearly is. But this state is fully realized here more than any other places. And I have to admit that I think that these places are, in a way, the true places of our global time. Let's change image. This talks about the opposite, not cold weather, but very hot weather. You see that there is people sweating outside. I was a lot more sweated than they were. It was 45 degrees, 48 in August in Doha. And climate is a big issue when you go to the Gulf. I really suffer. Most of the months, the climate is very hot. And it's a problem for photography because the lenses get fogged. There is too much humidity. So more or less happens what in other parts of the world happens during the winter, when you go inside and the inside is warm and humid and the outside is cold. So your glasses, for example, get fog up, let's say in this way. So it's something that made me reflect, because, for example, we stay with the heating for 6 months every year. And for example, in winter months, I heat up my apartment and then I cool it in part because my fridge has to be at 4 degrees. So it's 4 outside, then it's 20 inside, and inside the fridge is again 4. So in the beginning, it was very easy to me to think that, it's just crazy to stay with the air conditioning for most of the year. But then it's more complex to, to have such a shortcut in the evaluation of these places. Of course, there are extremes, as we have seen in the having snow in the desert. But in general, going to the Gulf is quite an interesting exercise in questioning our lifestyles and our behaviors our as Westerns, as European, as Italian. Then again, an image of workers. The transfer of low-cost labor to the Gulf countries is the most controversial and difficult issue to deal with. In general terms and also in photographic terms. It's a taboo. My experience is that despite being everywhere, workers must not be seen in photographs. You cannot talk about them. And if you do, you risk to be thrown into a difficult situation. In the West, this issue of immigration, of labor, it's often approached from radical positions, which are easy to share, of course, on an ideological level, but which do not sufficiently delve into the specificities of all the places and the cultures. So sometimes, most times, it ends up ignoring that the same problems exist in different ways in all the rich countries. So I decided, for example, to include this image in the book because I wanted to show people working, but at the same time, I wanted to show people that were, just doing something very simple like resting. Of course, this man is on the top of a tower, of a 70 floors tower, so he doesn't have the time to to go downstairs during the hour of break because it would take too much time. So they just he, as many other people, just take a rest on the construction site. And I wanted to show how simple and the dignity of these people that are just making their life in these places, working hard. And I believe that photography is an important tool for discussion. My experience is that a photograph like this one, for example, carefully made, without being too sentimental, without screaming, without aestheticizing too much, can be the starting point for a discussion and for frankly arguing about even the most delicate political topics. So this is one of the takeaway messages of this book, of course. So I hope that people will experience a deeper and more problematic way of seeing these cities, but in general, the urban landscapes that we all consider, that we all have in mind. Each of these photographs was chosen because it contains a variety of subjects, and all these subjects have a certain relationship. So there are many levels of interpretation in all of these pictures. Most of these images are conceived not with a single subject, but to let the eye linger on different parts, and they need time to come to terms with them. So to understand and to appreciate this work, who sees the work, it takes some time to take to understand it and to have a relation with the images, both emotionally and conceptually. So this kind of openness, because many different people have looked at this work and they recognize different things in this work. And the more the work is shown, the more meanings it assumes. So there is a kind of opening to different interpretations. And as far as I'm concerned, this openness, this availability of meanings is a really important task for photography, especially today when where reality is flooded and constructed with many easy to eat images that we find especially online. let's go on a little bit with skylines. The skyline is an important theme, of course, in all those cities because they are all crazy about skylines. And in the book, this image and this other image are paired in 2 pages because while construction workers take their break on site, here you can see a Western family that sits on the beach in front of the skyline. I always search for spots to look at skylines, as many people do around the world. And of course, over the year, I have wondered what a skyline is. So what we can see in short is that the skyline is an image. So it's really an image like this. It's an image capable of giving a desirable and consistent idea of a city, even in the absence of an actual urban project. So it's very different from the European traditional city that we know. It's not, for example, a boulevard of the 19th century. It's not a square of the Baroque. It's an image. It's a 2-dimensional image of the city, and it has to be seen from afar. So from, for example, the other side of a river or of a stretch of sea. And it has a peculiar iconicity, is right, this 2-dimensionality that makes it so iconic. And this is why it attracts people, including myself, so much. The skyline, of course, as we have mentioned, comes from Manhattan originally. It was born at the end of the 19th century, and it emerged in a way that was radically new. Of course, cities were already represented as, long views, elongated views, but the skyline, the modern skyline, is something that came out through the work of photographers and amateurs photographers, and it was widespread in newspapers and popular media. I believe that it's right, this pop quality that makes the skyline so beloved, to the point that now the skyline symbolizes the contemporary city more than any other urban form. So when you think of a modern city, you have in mind the image of skyline. In the Gulf, the cities are, as I said, obsessed with skylines, which is a sign of their super rapid development and a way to affirm their prosperity. And in some of the most brazen cases, such as those of Dubai and Doha, the skyline became a part of global imagination and the common language. We talk about Dubai, talking about a vertical city, even if this skyline exists only since a few decades. And these places became new reference points for other cities in the world. So cities in the East, in Asia, East Asia, are imitating and taking these cities of the Gulf as a reference. Of course, there is one of the cliches, as in this picture, which is the idea that these cities have miraculously sprouted from the desert almost overnight, which of course is not true. They all derive from complex stories, which are difficult to tell and to study. And this is one of the reasons why I've been so many times, and I've been working so much time in Gulf cities. The skyline is also interesting because it can be, quite delusionary, because as all the images, it is associated with the so-called principle of polarity. So the idea that one thing in one image can take the opposite meaning while still showing the same thing. So if you look at the skyline from far, you would think of vitality and you know, a certain kind of urban experience at the foot of the buildings. But sometimes you just, you know, when you walk through the skyline, you enter the city, your experience is the opposite. So there is a rarefied and alienating effect of the city. So most of the pictures I made in this book are the opposite, are a way to see and to investigate what goes on at the foot of the buildings. But of course, sometimes it's also interesting to see the city from outside, also because it's conceived as an image, as for Doha, for this part of Doha, that has imitated the skyline of Dubai to the point of being a distortion of the city itself. And I know that these kind of images are somehow tried, the idea of looking at someone that is looking at something else. But at the same time, I cannot stop looking at this skyline, at this image, and thinking that many and most of the cities of big cities of the world are somehow doing the same, taking on the same path. So it's Doha, but it's a warning about what's going on in many cities in the world. Then I would like to end my my speech with a few images that deal more directly with architecture and architectural photography. This is a building in Abu Dhabi. It's the headquarters of the largest real estate actor in Abu Dhabi. And I firstly photographed this building when it was under construction more than 10 years ago. And it ended up in the cover of another book, which I published, that was about the use of iconic architecture in the, you know, in the process of city making. But here, I'm not interested in icons as a spectacle. I'm not interested in architecture as a spectacle. I'm interested in architecture as something which is there. I want to see the building from very close. I want to show that there is a materiality in the building. And that that is why in this photograph, the building, the architecture, despite looming with a surreal effect, appears for what it is, a large building of glass, of steel and concrete, and to show that at its foot, you can smoke a cigarette, you can chat and drink a coffee sitting at the table. Another example of buildings in Abu Dhabi. This is the world's famous Louvre in Abu Dhabi. So I think most of you have seen pictures of the interior of this place, which I followed since the presentation in 2007 when I was working with Lotus. And then I visited the excavations, I photographed the excavation, and I also attended the inauguration in 2017 to the present day. So if you wonder if this is a picture of architecture, I would say yes, but it's not much about the design of the building, but it's more about the idea of a transfer, because this photograph show the building, but the whole operation of the Louvre is actually a long and complex and sensational transfer of different things, of words like art, like history, like culture, etc. Of behaviors, because usually the Arab you know, the Arabs just are not used to go to museums. Transfer of works of art that comes from many different places in the world, but mostly from Europe. And there is a lot of figurative work, which is unusual for the Arab culture, which is not figurative. And there are nudes, for example, which are problematic within the Arab cultures. And then there is the transfer of images, of people, of skills, who made the, who designed the building, of a lot of money. And I think about how much in this process of transfer, how much was transformed or sacrificed. Because in all transfers, in all translation, there is something that gets transformed or missed. Also, the ambitions of the Museum of the Louvre in Abu Dhabi are a huge historical transfer, because the idea of the museum is to create a musée universal, so a museum that contains all histories of all arts and all periods of art history. That was something that Napoleon used to think about when he was at the height of his conquests. So he wanted the Parisian Louvre to become a universal museum. And so that's why, for example, Italians have to go to Paris to see some of their old masterpieces. Last couple of buildings. One is the Burj Khalifa. I already spoke about it, this building, which is the tallest building in the world. And this is an image taken at the foot of the building, where you see the building, but also a lot of other things. The thing that comes to my eyes more clearly here is the fact that the building, together with the spectacle of fountains that's conceived close to it, it's a magnet for photographers. It's conceived to be photographed every day and to circulate globally through the images that these people will post online. And of course, it's completely different to show this place in this way rather than in this way. And this is the so-called hero view of a tower, where you see the wall designed, the wall building as it is designed. And I have to admit that I really cannot take straight photography pictures, because in this case, you can see a lot of the surroundings of the building. You can see the fountains, you can see other buildings, you can see the horizon. But of course, it's important to edit a work and to think what you want to include and what you don't want to include, what you want to show, because you want to tell something about the place. So going back to the foot of the building, for example, if you take a picture 5 minutes later, you see a different scene. You see the faces of the people instead of the spectacle. So these people are any people. These people are some people. I think it makes a difference. And also, I include this image because this place at the foot of the tallest building of the world, where there is the tallest building, the tallest fountain show, the largest mall. So everything is exaggerated here. Everything is, megalomaniac. But at the same time, this is the only place that recalled to my mind the idea of a piazza, of a square, of a public place, even if, of course, it's not public. It's all private. It's owned by a company, which is, in turn, it's a state company. So it's also public, but everything is owned by the sheikh. So it's very complicated to know who owns what. And it's also, it reminds me that sometimes images as well as words keep the same sound, or they keep the same appearance, but the meanings that you associate to these words or images can be very different, especially if you are in another part of the world. Another interesting building is this mosque in Qatar. It was designed by a European firm, and it's a picture I took in Friday, because on Friday there is here. It's called the Mosque of the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies. On Friday, you can see the prayer, and before the prayer, people gather from all over the city to meet. And I realized that in such hot places, the interior of the mosque becomes a place like the piazzas are, for example, for Italians, or used to be when the Italians went to the mass on Sundays. And this is an interesting building. This is a picture I shot during the prayer. It's interesting also in terms of architecture because it's the only building I met in more than 10 years of of traveling in these places, which is not a classical building. So it's modern and iconic, but it's a religious building. And so it's a sign of a different relationship between Islam and modernity, which is, of course, a big problem of these cultures. Last two images are related to the idea of history and to the idea of architecture through history. So here I started to mull over, to think about these columns. We don't, we give for granted that we find columns all over the world and in different places. But here in Manama, in Bahrain, I found this corner of the street with these Ionic columns. So I have in one image, I have at least 2,500 years of architectural history, all, jumbling together from the Greeks of the columns of classic Greek to the minarets here of the mosques to the more recent examples of, vulgar skyscrapers of iconic buildings. And so it made me think how architecture can change the meaning depending on where it is and who is inhabiting and conceiving it, as it happens in this image. Then I want to end here. This is a picture I took on a beach in Abu Dhabi. And for me, this is a picture that is also a sort of meditation on history and on imagery. It's a place where buses of the national airline and some tankers of drinking water were parked. And aside for the vehicles, the whole image is almost in black and white. So the sand, the sky, the towers, including my hotel, from which I had noticed this place, are all almost gray or grayish. So when I was there, and every time I look at this picture, I think that places like this, it's just a sandy stretch in Abu Dhabi, exist in a sort of history that we really don't know. It's beyond the history that we know, the concept of history that we know. Or our land is shaped by history. Each artifact in Europe, and in particular in Italy, is there for a specific reason. It marks the territory and it fills the territory with meanings. So with a bitter lot, I think that this, somewhat pop photograph, which is somehow funny and surreal, it's also enigmatic and also a warning that what remains of our culture, our history, our civilization, it's only a sticker with some ruins from our history, an image that fades into black and white that is ready to transfer to the next airport. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michele. Okay, that was really rich. You have been raising a lot of issues. It's very interesting, your view of this cultural crash, let's say, that is a little bit at the core of globalization processes. And I think it's also interesting for us architects to have a glimpse on the creative process, on the behind the scenes of a work like that, because we are used to see photographs from, say, as observers, but having a glimpse on this backstage of your work, of your personal journey, of the motivations that have pushed you towards, let's say, the results is very interesting for me, and I think for the students as well. Anyway, I would like maybe to not to start the debate now, because or else we're not going to have enough time. So since it's 3:30, perfect. So we can maybe meet each other again at 40 with Davide's presentation, and then we are going to raise all the questions, because I already have some questions for Michele, but I would like to maybe cross the questions instead than having questions for each one of you separately. What do you think?
Yeah, for me it's fine.
Nice. So we can make a really brief break just to have a coffee, and at 3:40 we meet each other again and for Davide's presentation.
Okay.
See you in a few minutes. I stopping the recording, and then please help me to remember to start again the recording, or else I'm forgetting. Nice. I have started with the recording, so Davide, whenever you like, you can start with Other Skyscrapers. We can't hear. Where is Davide?
I was wondering if you could hear me or not. I'm not familiar with WebEx. No, I changed the cover of the lecture because Michele was here. So of course it's a slight turn that I gave to this let's say presentation, which I've been giving for the last few years several times, and which is what in the end brought me to the publication of the book. Actually, the book is a sort of like a printed version and expansion of this lecture, but this lecture originally, it's like 3 hours long. So what I had to do was to make a selection, which I hope is the best selection. Maybe I had to dismiss things which were more relevant. I don't know. But maybe
it's always a choice. You have to
yeah, I know. But
include and what to exclude.
I know.
But it's a political choice.
Let's say that if something is missing, I guess we will be able to discuss it during the further debate, also with Claudia. Anyway, the presentation is organized in 3 main chapters, which maybe, as Guy already said, may remind the 3 main chapters in which the book is organized, although some of the things which I will say, especially in the end, are not even present in the book, but it's some extra little stuff I added for this specific presentation. Let's say that the first part is maybe the most boring academic one, but to me it's necessary to make some sort of, to create a frame within which to speak of urban landscape, the search for the meaning, the origin of the word urban landscape was precisely the task which I gave to myself for my PhD. And let's say that what I'm going to tell you now is a sort of a quick reconstruction of the genealogy of this term, which, or maybe using the quoting somehow Walter Benjamin, it's a sort of brief history of urban landscape, just like Walter Benjamin wrote the brief history of photography. Wait, how do I? Oh, okay, so basically, I mean, of course, if we can speak of urban landscape, it's because today we have quite clear ideas, although the term is much more complex than what we think, of what let's say, rural landscape is and what an urban landscape is. So we would immediately refer to one or the other as almost equivalent, let's say, kinds or types of images with simply different surroundings. And we know also that, I mean, as far as it is quite harder to imagine that it's possible to define such a complex thing as a landscape or urban landscape, we had in 2000, in the October 2000 a famous convention where they gave some sort of definition of the word landscape. So according to the European Landscape Convention, landscape means an area, this is the shortened version of course, as perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and or human factors. Then let's say that probably to make a research about the meaning of urban landscape could sound pretty stupid, because I mean, of course, you can just add the word urban to this definition and say that urban landscape means an urban area as perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and or human factors. Probably this will be enough. But of course, from the moment in which you decide not to go for the quick route and take a much longer route to understand the meaning of a word, you start to learn a lot of things, which are the things which I learned during my 3.5, I would say, years of PhD. And for sure, one of the things which I learned is that, I mean, yes, still today we can imagine somehow that this the idea of landscape is related, and we know that the idea of landscape is related to the personal perception of a particular kind of surrounding. These two paintings from Caspar David Friedrich, the one on the left, and Gustave Caillebotte, the one on the right, speak more or less of the same thing, which is two people with their own personal point of view, which by the way reminds me of one of the last pictures shown by Michele before. Look at this urban territory on the right and this, let's say, mountainous environment on the left, and they have their own personal, let's say, feelings which they attach to this environment, which is what generates a landscape. But as a matter of fact, the point is that just like the landscape, the concept of landscape, the idea of landscape is not natural, it's not something we were born with, but it was actually, according to literature, born around the 17th century, let's say between the 16th and 17th century. Also, the concept of urban landscape is a historical concept. In a sense, it's cultural, it's produced, it's not something we were born with. We will see when it was born. This is the first part of my presentation, which means basically that we haven't always watched the city like the man from Gustave Caillebotte, Man at the Window, but throughout history, we learned to look at the city in different ways. And the reconstruction of the evolution of our eye in front of the, let's say, urban space is precisely what I did as part of my PhD thesis. And one of the main references, let's say, one of the main concepts which accompanied me throughout this investigation is one by Augustin Berg, a very important author as far as the idea of landscape is concerned, who wrote, among many super interesting things, that just as the landscape of our individual experience in any moment and place is necessarily limited by a certain horizon, you know, the horizon that we see when we look at a territory, landscape in general, so landscape as a concept, let's say, is limited by the horizon of a certain vision of the world, which is characteristic of a certain context, of a certain culture, and of a certain epoch. This means basically, as I was saying before, that in different historical periods, the vision of territorial vision, let's say environmental vision, had different meanings. This is true both for the, let's say, non-urban as it is for the urban environment. But how did we learn to look at the city? How did we learn to finally at a certain moment to look at the city as a landscape? To reconstruct the story, it's probably a good thing to start from the, let's say, late 13th century. This image by Cimabue, which unfortunately this painting doesn't exist anymore because the cupola on which it was painted in Assisi fell during one of the earthquakes in the last decades, is a very important image because it tells us something about the way in which the medieval culture did look at the city. Here, Italia, the Italy, somehow is represented as a city. It is represented as a city which is made of a certain amount of iconic, we could say today, or famous, monumental, probably, buildings, which are surrounded by walls with a door, a gate, and some towers. This painting is important not only because Cimabue was the, let's say, maestro of Giotto, who then I'm going to speak about very soon, but it's important because it summarizes more or less the way in which cities were represented throughout all the Middle Ages, which is a selection of monumental, let's say, main buildings, main architectures, we could say, surrounded by walls with a gate or more gates and some watchtowers. There's absolutely no realistic representation of cities in the Middle Ages, not even close to what they did look like, not even close in the sense that the selection of buildings were really gathered and made together like assemblages or like collages. And the point is that when we look at these documents, these visual documents, what we learn is that if no painter ever painted the city as it actually looked like, it means that in that historical period, the actual look of the city was not something interesting or aesthetically relevant to society. Because of course, if it was something aesthetically relevant to society, we would have some visual documents, some paintings, some engravings, whatever, would actually represent the cities as they looked like. But these documents don't exist. So the first thing that we learn by looking at the history of the representation of the city is that the documents that represent the city actually represent the kind of eye that we project on the city. So we can reconstruct the eye by reconstructing the documents. One very important step forward to, let's say, the transformation of the eye towards the city would be documented by Giotto, as I said, who's a very important author, especially because he's the first one, as far as we know, who started to represent the city from inside. Okay, so before Giotto, the cities were always represented from the outside, from a sort of aerial view, as we saw in Cimabue. But Giotto is the first one to actually dive inside of the space of the city and represent these, let's say, religious histories within the urban space. What is important to say is that, of course, we cannot yet speak of urban landscape for the fact that the subject of this painting is not the city. The city is a background, which is fine. So the most important thing is not the city itself, but it's the history, the sacred history which is happening within the space of the city. And the second thing we have to say is that the buildings which Giotto represents in this painting, again, are not existing buildings. Giotto would go around Assisi, the different cities he wanted to place his histories into, and he would take sketches from corners of buildings, from parts of the architectures that he liked, and then he would recompose them precisely like collages and put invented buildings produced out of these sketches as backgrounds for his histories. So again, the city which is represented is not the real city, is an invented city which is based anyway on the real one. We know that then during the Renaissance, the codes for representation of city change, also because of the introduction of perspective. And it is important to say that once more, the kind of cities that are represented in this historical period are not yet the cities as they were. Also because the moment in which a perspective was introduced and used as a tool to represent the typical, let's say, Renaissance architecture, this kind of architecture didn't exist yet. We know that Renaissance architecture first existed in drawings, and then eventually it was realized. So when we look at the ideal cities of Urbino, Baltimora, and Berlin, what we're actually looking at, people say, could be either in the two main interpretations, because there's still a doubt about what they were, these drawings, which have so many things in common, but no one understands really what is the subject. Could either be sketches, let's say preparatory sketches for theatrical scenes, so scenographies, basically, or exercises on perspective. As a matter of fact, the technique of representation of perspective works really well if you want to draw buildings, because especially these Renaissance buildings have a very clear geometries and irregular geometries which work well and can be well designed, well drawn when drawn through the means of central point perspective. So some of the interpretations are actually that since you cannot draw perspective, but you have to draw something through perspective, this could also very well be production of a drawing technique, which is actually quite an interesting hypothesis, as a matter of fact. This is just to reinforce the fact that the representation of the city was actually very much connected during the Renaissance and also late Renaissance with the idea of the theatrical stage. Sebastiano Serlio's indications on how to build a tragic scene, a comic scene, and a satirical scene were accompanied in his treatise with these three illustrations in which the tragic and comic scenes are actually designed as urban spaces of very different character. Let's say monumental, the tragic scene, more ordinary, the comic one, for reasons which are attached to the idea that the tragedies are the tragedies of the rich, and the comedy is the life of the, let's say, the poor or the ordinary man. But as a matter of fact, what starts to emerge is that it's not simply that theatrical scenes and scenographies were built like spaces of the city because it was a reference which was easy to use, or simply because the histories or the stories which were told happened in the space of the city. We start to assist to a sort of compenetration for which this theatrical space resembles the space of the city because, as a matter of fact, the city is understood as a sort of theatrical space. This compenetration between the system of representation, between the representation and, let's say, the real space or the represented space, is something that we witnessed throughout the centuries. And indeed, it speaks of the fact that the city is always something too complex to be capable of describing, of addressing with a, let's say, an all-encompassing definition or explanation. So Western culture, at least throughout centuries, always found some sort of possible mediation, cultural mediation, in this case theater, to speak of the city, to understand the city, always from very specific points of view, which would exclude others, as you can imagine, and also by means of recurring to specific kind of techniques or representation techniques. So the three things are very much connected: the representation technique, so the technology, we could say, the cultural mediation, and finally the city, which is always city as something. In this case, the city as theater. Of course, cartography is extremely important in the evolution of the representation of the city. This painting, famous painting, which is actually, there's a couple of them, Views of Toledo, but the View and Plan of Toledo from El Greco in 1608 is interesting to us because, first of all, it makes explicit the relationship between painting, let's say, images of the city representation, and cartography. So this man is actually holding in his hand a piece of cartography and a chart and a map, and behind there's the city of Toledo, which is the object of the map as well. So there's always a relationship in between, let's say, the painting and the cartography of the same place. But again, if we really look at how the city of Toledo is being painted by El Greco, once more we see that it's not the real city, not only because there's the hospital, which is flying on top of a cloud, which you can see in the middle of the composition, but also because the relative position of the buildings and the relative scale of the buildings has been once more modified in order to make enhance certain objects rather than others. So once more we are seeing a growth of interest towards the look of cities, which by then were still kind of small enough to be designed and drawn as surrounded by the countryside. This will not be the case anymore at a certain moment, as we will see. But still, the real look of the city is not something interesting to painters, to the point that they can modify without any problem the position and scale of the buildings to produce their own stories. Of course, this cartography was also a cartography related to maritime routers. The first attempt to reproduce the actual look of the cities probably come from the world of marine cartography. So the people who would navigate throughout the seas or along the rivers would draw these city profiles in order to make the future sailors able to recognize what cities they were actually seeing at a distance while they were approaching through sea again or river, because they would compare these profiles they had in their maps, in their cartographies, in their routers, to the image they would see. And so this moment of recognition would be possible, so they would know where they were going to land in that very moment. So orientation was mediated by means of this sort of technique. And it's not a chance that this was a particularly strong technique of representation in Dutch culture. I mean, they were, of course, sailors and merchants, as you know. And it's not by chance that the very first early Western attempts to represent the city as it looked, precisely as it looked, so without attaching stories of, let's say, sacred stories, also because it was a very secular society, the one in the Dutch one, if compared, for example, to the Spanish one or the Italian one, without modifying the position of the buildings. We see these sort of representations in Holland during the 17th century, which is, by the way, when precisely where and when first landscape representations started to emerge. We cannot yet, though, speak of let's say urban landscape. This may sound like a sort of picky selective decision, but the point is that, as a matter of fact, these paintings which were made for the rich families of merchants who in that specific century, the 17th century, were freeing themselves from the dominion, the cultural and economical and political dominion of the Spanish, because you know that Holland has been under the Spanish Empire for quite a while, and they wanted to establish their, let's say, their status as a free country and as, let's say, rich merchants, independent from the Catholic Church. They also were commissioning these views to show how rich and how beautiful Dutch cities were, in order to somehow establish their, as already said, their own status. So more than landscapes, which would mean a kind of representation of a territory without a real intention, if not an aesthetical one, this would be more like nature morte, it would be in Italian, or almost family portraits, but that show buildings instead of families or people, as a matter of fact. But these different way of looking at the cities, which is to look really at the city how it looked like, started to migrate down from the Central Europe to Italy. Caspar van Vittel, who was of course not Italian but was coming also from Northern Europe, came to Italy, and he's famous for introducing these new techniques of representation, this new method of looking at cities such as Venezia, which were starting really to replicate the phenomena, the urban phenomena, as they were unfolding in front of his eyes. Then we have, let's say, further evolutions of this. You all know probably Canaletto. Who doesn't know Canaletto? But as accurate as Canaletto's paintings were, there was a lot of scenographic intentions in them. Basically, Canaletto was using the camera oscura to build up impossible views of Venezia, which would show almost panoramas which were impossible to see with the eye. So Canaletto was indeed influenced by Caspar van Vittel, but he was much more related to the scenographical tradition of Italian painting than from the, let's say, cartographical tradition of Dutch painting. And then probably we could say that at the end of the 18th century, this super small painting by Francesco Guardi, which is here in Milano, by the way, it's a fantastic, very small painting, starts to address for the first time some sort of representation which could look like it is an urban landscape, because for the first time, in this case, Venezia, or the lagoon of Venezia, is represented in a way that is also transmitting some sort of emotions without attaching these emotions to any specific sacred or secular story. It's simply this environment, which is not anymore an objectively represented environment, but it is an environment represented through the eye of the painter, which is something that we started to understand is very close to the idea of landscape. Then accelerating towards the, let's say, between the 18th and 19th century, we start to see also other kinds of representations, such as Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who's highlighting the interest and the value of the ruin and also of urban space as a space made of complex spaces which intersect one in the other. But really there is no time to go too much into this. But this is a period in which the cities are at the very same time growing. They're growing, they're becoming very complex, huge beings, which the painters start to also have some troubles in representing. It's not by chance that in the very same time the cities, also through the Industrial Revolution, start to grow and expand and become the metropolises that we know today. or at least at the metropolises of the 19th and early 20th century. Also, new techniques of representation from different points of view emerge, such as the panorama, which was basically a sequence of paintings which will be produced in and then presented in a 360 degrees room, which would somehow summarize and represent with extreme detail all the look of a city from a vantage point, such as, for example, a tower, a lookout tower, or a cupola of a church, and so on. This was a new technique which had a lot of success in the period. It's a sort of, let's say, ancestor to cinema, we could say, because the place where these images where these round images were shown were specific buildings built appositely to show these images. So people, instead of looking at the real panorama of London, they would go to the London Panorama by Thomas Horner to look at the represented panorama. And one thing which is worth to say is that in that historical period, these images were so true. To us, they are not, of course, but for them, they were so true that you have articles written by journalists who were praising the absolute realism of this representation, so much that it really looked like people were there immersed in these places which are only represented. Quickly getting to the end of this first part of the presentation, the introduction of the camera is fundamental for the construction of the idea of urban landscape for several reasons, but mainly because the cameras start to add a technological layer of distance from the object of the representation and from the eye of the one who represents. And this distance is kind of necessary to understand the kind of aesthetical approach to urban landscape that is typical of landscape itself, which means something which is always seen from outside of it. I want to tell you the story of the fact that landscape is, of course, an urban creation as a concept, because only when you look at the countryside without having to work in the countryside, you can have a purely aesthetical vision of the countryside. But to look at the city where you live exclusively aesthetically, the fact that you have the mediation of the camera, that's something which helps. This is one of the first photographs ever taken by Louis Daguerre, who you can see apparently posing in front of the little fountain in the bottom left corner of the image. And photography, precisely because of technical limitation, is also important because it invented new points of view, which are all related to the fact that they could not move the first photographic machines. They could only photograph the city space from the rooms where these huge machines were actually installed. Higher and higher, we start to have these first helicopter views, which we'll see later in the presentation, which are made by the first, let's say, photographer who did fly. Nadar would go on a balloon and photograph the city of Paris from a very high point of view. The first time such a point of view was used to represent the city. And this is a moment in which the city starts also to confound itself with the surrounding environment, and the city starts to be seen as a territory as vast as the, let's say, as the rural territory in front of it. And the fact that the two merge one in the other in these foggy images also starts to suggest the possibility to look at the city as a landscape. Also, technical problems with the first cameras starts, for example, to emerge, like the fact that these long exposition times would make the people who were walking on the bridge of Arts in London blurry, as you can see. And this specific technical fault, some say, was directly transferred into the paintings of the Impressionists, who started to represent the city from what we could finally say was really a kind of landscape point of view, in the sense that they would, as they say, represent the condition of light, but this condition of light would be also, of course, charged with a lot of personal feelings and emotions. And it's not by chance that the concept of urban landscape was born more or less by the end of the 19th century, not only when the Impressionists started to represent this city stealing somehow some technical mistakes of the camera, but also when the city was, or by then, the modern metropolis, which was transforming at a speed that never had it been transformed before. As a matter of fact, the first person who uses or somehow puts together the idea of city with the idea of landscape is the great poet of modernity. It was Charles Baudelaire, who in 1863, in his very famous little book, The Painter of Modern Life, speaks of this painter who is the main subject, main character of the book, writing, and off he goes, and he watches the flow of life move by, majestic and dazzling. He admires the eternal beauty and the astonishing harmony of life in the capital cities, a harmony so providentially maintained in the tumult of human liberty. He gazes at the landscape of the great city, landscapes of stone, now swathed in the mist, now struck in full face by the sun. This is arguably the first time that we see landscape and city being associated as concepts, and soon another concept will be born, which is townscape, from which then our modern, let's say, contemporary acception of urban landscape was born. But I thought it was necessary to arrive to this point, at least to show you how we slowly build up a very complex way of looking at the city. As a matter of fact, the way which we look at the city now, I mean, from Baudelaire until now, there could be so many things to show of how our gaze has been evolving even more. And Michele has already shown you a lot of these images. So I only wanted to somehow use this one image, which is from a series of artworks by Mishka Henner, which are nothing but screenshots from Google Maps, which is called Dutch Landscapes. Which I find particularly relevant because it speaks of a couple of things which are very important in defining how our gaze towards the city is constructed today. First of all, we for sure very much look at the city throughout this digital environment and these digital tools which surround us, from Google Maps to drones, security cameras, and so on, which we think is a kind of neutral point of view, but as a matter of fact, it's everything but not neutral. And the fact that, for example, as Mishka Henner discovered, several areas in Google Maps are hidden from our gaze because maybe there are military bases or jails or prisons and so on, tells us of the fact that there's still a lot of intentionality and a lot of things are, let's say, hidden from our eye, just as there are power relations that decide what we see when we see the city. And this is a bit one of the concepts that I would like to address in the next part of the presentation. The second part, sorry, I go really fast, I know, but unfortunately, every time they give me little time to present, I accelerate even more my speed of talk. This second part is just a small point that I want to make about, yes, but how do we look at the city, beside the fact that our eye evolves, no? So what is really the mechanism that allows us to look to an urban landscape and see something instead of something else? There's a very famous theatrical piece by Oscar Wilde titled The Decay of Lying, in which Oscar Wilde at a certain point, through the voice of his characters, makes a famous statement, which is like a paradox. And the paradox, I'm going to only read the first sentence, is that paradox though it may seem, life imitates art far more than art imitates life. I'm not going to read all of it, just listen to me. But the main concept in this idea that art imitates life imitates art far more than art imitates life is basically that we don't, so the artworks do not represent reality, the artworks make reality. So from the moment in which you do represent something, that something that you represented starts to be seen not only by the author of the representation, but by anything else. Therefore, our way of looking at reality is produced by the cultural mediations of reality itself. We look at the city through the eyes of the painters who represented the city. This was the claim of Oscar Wilde. And as a matter of fact, it's the same thing which is very well said in this super nice movie by Woody Allen, Midnight in Paris. In this movie, the main character, he's a writer. He goes to Paris. He's in a creative crisis. And every night he would walk around Paris and suddenly he would meet all the main characters of the Paris he knows from his studies. So the famous writers, the famous actresses and actors and so on, that were born in previous, let's say, decades than the moment in which he was actually walking around Paris at night. So what he was experiencing was not Paris as it was. He was experiencing Paris as he knew it through the readings he had made. So the readings produced the image of Paris that he was then telling to us throughout this movie. So this process is very clearly, let's say, described in this super nice movie. And as a matter of fact, I guess that all of us, when we look at the Bacino di San Marco, if we know these fantastic and super famous drawings and paintings by Caspar van Bittler, or the ones by Canaletto, by Guardi, by Bellotto, and so on, we all, when we look at Venezia, actually do not see Venezia as it is in front of our eyes. We see the Venezia of Bellotto, we see the Venezia of Canaletto, because these paintings are so powerful that they are behind our eyes every time we see again this city. They enter, they become part of our culture of mediation of Venezia. And so when Wim Wenders in the fantastic movie Pina organizes this choreography in this quite crazy, very traffic corner of this German city, which I don't remember, maybe it was Hamburg, but I'm not sure. What he's doing, he's not representing a particular view of the city. He's creating a new point of view of the city. He's creating a new imaginary. And everybody who has seen his movie, when they will go to this place, they will remember seeing this specific corner, and they will start to see this piece of the city precisely in the way that Wim Wenders taught them to see it. This is a very important process, which Alain Roget, who you know very well, calls artialisation, and he writes in his short treatise on landscape that our eye, even when we think of it as poor, is rich and saturated of an abundance of latent models, rooted and therefore beyond suspicion, coming from painting, literature, cinema, television, commercials, etc., which act unconsciously in order to shape our experience, perceptive or not. We see what we know, we see what we have already seen, basically. And this is very easy to document if we make comparisons to movies like the Sign of the Lion by Eric Rohmer from 1962 to this picture by Eugene Auger from 1911, which takes basically the same point of view because one probably had seen the other and was influenced by it. The same goes between this painting from Edward Hopper and this movie by Herbert Ross, if I remember correctly, which are separated by 40 years. This is actually a literal representation of a representation, as a matter of fact. We all know that Alfred Hitchcock, Psycho, the House of the Mother is actually super directly inspired by this painting by Edward Hopper from 1925. And also it's very difficult not to think of the image of the empty Gran Via in Abras los Ojos from 1997, when we see this Times Square image taken by Lucie and Simon by means of a long exposition time, which deletes all the people walking through Times Square, generating this surreal emptiness. And again, it's very much possible that just like Beniamino Servino did work on this original image, I mean, on top of a copy of an image of an urban landscape by Hilberseimer, generating this sort of distorted perspective of a building with a high pitched roof, it is possible that this sort of vision, this sort of point of view, this sort of urban image was still present in the eye of the photographer or something similar to it when the picture of this building by CPUS Architetti was taken. Images circulate, they influence us, and they re-emerge when we are producing them, which is why this was let's say, the conceptual point to make in this second part of the short part of the presentation. When we speak of urban landscape, just like when we speak of landscape, we are actually speaking of three things which are related. There's a landscape which is the represented landscape, the Darstellung, which is an artistic representation that crystallizes the scenery of imagination in reference to a selected part of the Earth's surface. But we're also speaking of another kind of landscape, which is the imagined landscape, the Vorstellung, which is an internal representation or idea we form when we perceive a selected part of the Earth's surface. And in finding these two, not only they're connected between each other, but they're also connected to the constructed landscape, the Gestaltung, which is a configuration of matter already present in the external environment in virtue of a human intervention. So the way in which we think, the way in which we represent, and the way in which we construct landscape are all inevitably connected. There's not like a consequential sequence, it's more like a chicken and egg. They're all at the very same time present and at the very same time influencing and changing each other. Last part of the presentation, sorry if I really rushed until now, maybe I have time to go a little bit slower here, but it is basically...
Take 10 minutes more, no problem. Don't die, please.
No, okay. I see I'm 36 minutes by now, so I still have some some minutes left. So the third and last part of the presentation is about the emerging of this urban image as really, let's say, a technique, a tool for the transformation of the city. We always, one of my problems when I was doing my PhD was the fact that I was more thinking or having the feeling that speaking of urban images for the sake of the urban image itself was kind of poor and superficial. I was really wondering what kind of role do images play in the production of the city? And I think that I kind of found somehow some sort of solution, at least to my own uneasiness with the topic that at a certain moment seemed too artistic to be really valuable in architectural terms, which is precisely the emergence of this third city, as I ended up calling it in the book. The emergence of the third city is something that we can understand starting from a very well-known concept, the concept of urbs and civitas, which is a concept that comes from the Middle Ages. Marco Romano writes very well in several books, but especially in this one from 2005, that the materiality of an inhabited center isn't just the manifestation of a congregation of individuals, more or less linked by family bonds or intentions, but physically represents the conscious collective will to build a political subject. And so the fact that the civitas and urbs are united, just as the palm and the back of a hand, changes the very nature of the visible city. What Marco Romano is reminding us is that the way in which the city looks and let's say, sorry, the physical layer of the city and the social layer of the city are deeply intertwined, just like Ambrogio Lorenzetti would draw were painting the Effetti del Buon Governo in Città, where like a beautiful city made of beautiful buildings is also necessarily, according to the painter, a city where people have, let's say, rich, good economic relationships in which they take care of the city and so on and so forth. So there was always in the Western mind the idea that the physical layer and the social layer of the city are one with the other. They're impossible to, they're deeply intertwined. They're impossible to separate. But as a matter of fact, I think we can say that there's a third layer, at least, which has to be taken in consideration, which is precisely this layer that comes from the imago, so not the urbs, not the civitas, but the imago, so the image of the city. And how does it enter into play? I'll just make some examples. This is a very well-known example. What would then become the High Line in New York. In 2000, a photographer, Joel Sternfeld, jumped on top of this abandoned railway and took some pictures of the abandoned state of this railway, which got published some days later on, I think, the New York Times. The fact that these images, which no one had seen basically ever, got produced and published and circulated, had a series of consequences which are quite amazing, which you all know, because a committee was formed, to reclaim this space as a space for the production of a new part of the city, which then would become the High Line, which is a famous linear park that you can find in New York, which was famously designed by Dilla Sconfino and Renfro, plus other offices which made the landscape design, which are never named, and I forgot also to name myself. But the most important thing is that the uncovering of these images didn't simply open up for the possibility of this abandoned artifact to become public space. It also had the dramatic, I would say, consequences on the immediate surroundings, because it generated a huge linear process of gentrification of all the neighborhoods which were touched by the High Line, producing a real process of exclusion of, let's say, middle lower classes, which couldn't afford anymore living in those areas and had to move outside of the city with a typical process, precisely because the presence of the High Line made these neighborhoods unaffordable for those who did live inside of them before. So you see how one simple image, or a series of beautiful images, as a matter of fact, by a very good photographer, had such a dramatic effect on the transformation of a city such as New York. But probably more notably, and especially for today, I will expand a little bit more in the last few minutes on this topic. The view from above, which is also the kind of view that Michele has been talking about in his fantastic presentation, has also become in the last few years, especially in certain parts of the world, among which New York precisely, a very strategic asset, which is also responsible for the kind of transformation that some areas, for example, of New York, and also the transformation that the social layer of New York is going through. As you may know, in the last few years, let's say in the last decade or 15 years, several projects of transformation have happened in New York City, in Manhattan, which involve the construction of what are called the pencil skyscrapers, which is mostly residential skyscrapers, which are super tall and super skinny, which have been especially built around an area in Central Park, which is called now Billionaire Row, if I'm not wrong. These are residential buildings whose main, let's say, asset is that of offering incredible views of New York City from a very far away place. More or less the idea that you see in this render of a project by Shop Architects, which is in its way to completion, was that you would have buildings so high that would residential towers so high that they would actually develop on top of the clouds. So this is not a real image. This is a fake. It's a render which communicates something which not necessarily would ever happen in New York. We don't know. But one thing that I could for sure say is that the imaginary that allowed the CGI expert to make this render somehow must relate to this other image, which on the other hand, yes, it's real. It's a photograph of Dubai, where you do have this sort of atmospheric phenomenon where this incredible platform of clouds generates a sort of below city and upwards city. Which, by the way, it is important to say, it was not always the case, as far as I've read, but maybe Michele knows it much better than I do, and he can help me with that. These sort of very thick clouds that enter into Dubai during winter time is a kind of a new phenomenon, which is related to a extreme change in the high and low temperatures between night and day. That wasn't experienced before, and this generates some sort of like change in the density of the air that in the morning leads to this dreamy landscape. So also you see how something which is aesthetically really strong, such as this idea of a city in the clouds, which somehow also relates to this background image that I chose for today's lecture, as a matter of fact, has much stronger networked ecological reasons for existing. So what was drawn in the CGI render was something purely aesthetical, but with a very strong intention for selling basically those apartments. And here, on the other hand, is almost one crazy effect of the Anthropocene era in which we all live by now, if we still live in the Anthropocene. There's now like a brief taxonomy of the kind of sky windows that generated this helicopter view that allows the future owners of these buildings to have a dominion, to possess not only their own apartment, but somehow to possess the whole of New York as far as they can see. But also please take care of the kind of ornament and style and architectural language of the interiors. If you think that most of these buildings try to have a very modern, contemporary look from the outside, now let's look how they look like from the inside. So you see, there's always in the end this huge window looking at this from this super elevated point of view that is almost impossible, one would imagine, from a building to Central Park. Here there's a project by Stern. This one doesn't really look modern, not even from the outside, I have to say. Or Christian de Potsdam Park. You even this is even so thin that you would have three windows, three transparent walls, let's say, in front of you in this sort of bedroom and plus living room, of course, looking at the other skyscrapers. So all the super rich people of New York can look at each other from on top of their fantastic apartments. Of course, Raffaele Vignoli's 432 Park Avenue, which was the one which was represented in the frame in the previous render, and which is also the first of these pencil towers, residential towers, to have been built. And then just to let you understand what is the real target of these images, of course, we are talking about super rich, heterosexual white male who are all CEOs of huge multinational companies and so on. So the let's say the marketing imaginary of these buildings is connecting together not only the fantastic view of the sky, but also usually women on their beds with dogs who look very much like them, by the way, or women in the kitchen with, again, the background of the city, or, sorry, women again with glasses of wine on the couch with a dog again waiting for something that we don't know, and still the city on the back. There's a very nice quotation by Michel de Certeau from 1993 in the text titled Walking in the City, which speaks of the experience of the World Trade Center. And Michel de Certeau writes that to be lifted to the summit of the World Trade Center is to be lifted out of the city's grasp. One's body is no longer clasped by the street that turn and return it according to an anonymous law, nor is it possessed, whether as player or played, by the rumble of so many differences and by the nervousness of New York traffic. When one goes up there, he leaves behind the mass that carries off and mixes up in itself any identity of authors or spectators. An Icarus flying above these waters, he can ignore the devices of Daedalus in mobile and endless labyrinths far below. His elevation transfigures him into a voyeur. As a matter of fact, the kind of relationship that these renders suggest between the owner of this domestic space and the owner somehow of this view, this privileged view on New York, is really a relationship of distance. As a matter of fact, these people don't care that much about the city that they look at. The city that they look at is a pure asset. It's the image of the city. It's not the city anymore. And we clearly see it in the logics that justify and legitimize the construction of these buildings. So all these buildings that I showed to you, they were all conceived, started to be conceived around 2005, in a moment in which the financial bubble was bursting, but they're only being completed now because it takes a lot of time for the owners to buy the pieces of land, to put together the air rights. I'm going to explain it right away. Of course, in the middle, there was the financial crisis of 2008. So it takes really a lot of time to build these towers. So we have to understand them not as projects from nowadays. They really are projects from another era, an era where there was a lot of optimism in the continuous growth and of the real estate market and the financial market in New York specifically. As a matter of fact, now that the financial market is not so good and the real estate market in New York is not so good, nearly half of luxury units are empty in 7 of the billionaire house buildings. So there's a big problem. So people do construct these towers and people do buy these apartments as financial assets, but they finance not because they want to move there, but because they want to make investments. But of course, if the financial situation is not so good, they don't buy these apartments anymore. And so New York is basically, because of reasons which are not connected to its real life, but that are connected to the global finance, is getting emptied, or at least is building skyscrapers that no one wants to move to. Of course, then the logics of this sort of architecture are also interesting. First of all, there's this idea of the race to the top. So which is the tallest building? Also, Michele spoke of the tallest, the largest, the highest, and so on. So the tallest wins, and it's actually quite interesting to know that there's several ways to make a building taller. And because everyone wants to have the tallest residential building in the hemisphere or the tallest residential building in the world, and so on and so forth. One of the way to make the tallest building is the taller or tallest building is to buy air rights. So this is a very nice, very funny, crazy law that exists in New York, but I guess also in other cities, where when you reach the top height of the plot where you're building, you can actually still buy further height from other plots which are undeveloped. So who has the most money can buy the most they're called air rights, and stack them on top of the height of the building which they're going to build. So in this case, there's an example of a building from 80 South Street with the different parts of height which were allowed by the building itself, let's say the regulations themselves. So, transfer of a right which already happened, and future or proposed transfer of a right. So the more air rights one buys, the higher the building they can make. There's also another couple of other technical tools for making the tallest building, which will give the best view. Again, remember, the view is an asset. So for example, these buildings, these super slender building, have a problem with the impact of horizontal force of wind. So a way that is usually chosen in order to reduce the impact of wind is to have like empty slots in between the floors, like every 10 floors or every 50 floors, I don't know, to have some empty floors where air can go through. So the horizontal force of the wind is moderated. But according to law, to normative, these empty technical floors do not count when the full height of the building is assessed according to normative. So making these technical rooms higher allows to have a higher building. And then there would also be, in this case, this is the 432 Park Avenue example. You even have some counterbalance load on top of it, which makes this building even higher, which means that the top part of the building is not inhabited. It's a purely technical, let's say, part of the building. And this is what is called also vanity height. You have to know that in order to make the building higher, there's also many skyscrapers have parts of the buildings which are not inhabited, not at all, but they simply serve the purpose of being able to then place their building in the top 5, top 10, top 2 list of the tallest buildings in the world. And there's a nice diagram which shows what percentage of these skyscrapers around the world is not used. And Burj Khalifa, by the way, has a big chunk of the final chunk of the building that, as far as I know, is also empty because it's also unusable because there's so much structure and services, there's not even space to live there. Then another innovation, of course, which is necessary if you really want to sell the views, then you have to make as many views as possible available. So we have a kind of housing which, although there's a lot of need for structure in the perimeter, everything that is not structured becomes window. So nothing which is not a kind of furniture where people can sit, so to be framed, as we saw in the previous renders, nothing happens around the borders of the house. All the furniture stays in the room or on the inner core of the floor plan. And then finally, one research, very nice research that Andres Hake has been making in the last few years about the blueness of the sky. Also, the blueness of the sky can be mobilized in order to make this building, let's say, more valuable. So to add value add more value to the building, because of course, if you want to buy $30 million apartment which has a super high view on Manhattan, you want to have a nice clear blue view of the city. But how do you actually provide a blue sky in architectural terms? There's a couple of things you can do. The first, I mean, also because Manhattan historically had a lot of problems with smog, with pollution, air pollution, so much so that since the 1960s, several laws were enforced to clean the air of Manhattan for, in that case, but still today, for health reasons, of course. One thing which you can do, as Andres Hake rightly says, is to adopt a certain kind of ultra clear glass which makes the sky bluer than it actually is, as seen from the inside to the outside. But the fact is that, which is quite interesting, and this is the kind of glass that now all skyscrapers and all residential towers, such as these ones I showed you, actually use. But what is important to say is that the production of this glass is possible through the extraction of very specific kind of silica, which is a white silica that is found only in certain, let's say, mines, especially like there's one in Ottawa, for example, or this one is in Illinois. So you already start to see how a purely, let's say, aesthetical decision, which has an economical influence, then has also consequences which are geological and, of course, environmental. But also, if that's not enough, you also have to think the fact that it's not enough to give a blue sky through a window if the sky is actually polluted. And as a matter of fact, there have been, since 2005, if I'm correct, several laws in New York from Mayor Bloomberg and also the next mayor, whose name I don't remember, to clean the air of New York from the most polluting agents, such as, let's say, the smokes that come from burning coal, substituting this the coal-based energy production to natural gas-based energy production. But natural gas-based energy production is based on fracking, which happens outside of New York, for example, in Pennsylvania. And therefore, in order to have a cleaner and bluer sky, the production of natural gas is, let's say, implemented. therefore polluting not anymore the sky of New York, but rather the land and the lakes and the rivers in Pennsylvania and in all these other territories which are around Manhattan, where now this energy is produced in order to have the cleaner sky in New York. And this is the result in the Susquehanna River, which is often extremely polluted precisely because the displacement of the energetic production and the displacement of the pollution. In this case, the more New York is clean, the more the territory around New York is basically dirty. Gaia, I could finish now, or I have 10 slides more. This is the double ending which I prepared in case I was long.
So 10 slides means like 10 minutes or 5 minutes?
No, I think 10, but I can really go to the end right now. It's I think it's okay if you prefer. Just let me know.
Put me in a bad situation because I would like to hear the rest, but of course in 1 hour we have to stop. Maybe if it's only 10 minutes, I guess you can finish, and then we have 50 minutes, full 50 of debate. So 50 minutes is enough, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, I just give the anecdote of Intesa San Paolo without going through these images, and actually I will simply tell you the story of another skyscraper, which is a skyscraper which was built in Torino recently under a project by Renzo Piano, who won a competition in 2007 for the new headquarters of a huge banking group, which is Intesa San Paolo. It is an interesting story because it also tells how the image of the city, let's say the image of skyscrapers and so on, can be mobilized not only to generate economic and social and environmental problems, but also, let's say, somehow, if not paradoxically, for the, let's say, good or for more democratic purposes. This building, which was the end of a private competition by Intesa San Paolo, was going to be built according to a double exception in the urban planning, to the urban planning norms. So this was going to be a building of 200 meters tall, which is nothing if compared to Burj Khalifa, of course, but for Torino would have been the tallest building in Torino. And this was only possible by somehow closing a couple of eyes on what the current norms would have allowed. So Intesa San Paolo was asking the city council to make exceptions for them so that they could build a higher building because they needed more space for their own headquarters. This generated, of course, a lot of protest. I'm not going to go into that, but rightly so, citizens gathered and there was an activism against the construction of these skyscrapers with also graffiti and protests in front of the city council, because they said, all for good reasons, that why should the city council make exception only for the banks, and did anyone think about the ecological impact that the skyscraper would have, and so on and so forth. But as a matter of fact, nothing was happening. There were very few people protesting, and this didn't really enter into the imaginary of the city. This didn't really lead to anything until a super small image, we're really talking about 480 pixels by 250 or something like that, was published on a blog on the blog of this committee of citizens, this grassroots movement, showing what the new skyscraper would be like in the landscape of Torino. So blooming on top of the Mole Antonelliana, which is the main monument of Torino, and cutting the line of the Alps. This super small image, which was completely wrong, by the way, in terms of its shape, the proportions, the position, and so on, generated an incredibly strong response from the public, to the point that it started to finally circulate among the mainstream media, to generate wider protests, and to have more and more people asking for the building never to be realized, to the point that Renzo Piano himself had to make a little piece of paper showing how that image was wrong. No, look at my skyscraper is going to be much, much smaller. It's not going to cut at the line of the Alps. So don't worry, it's okay. But it was too late. The interest of a huge banking company such as Intesa San Paolo suddenly was at stake because of the protest, and no one from the city council knew what to do, if not to tell, and more renders, of course, were being produced, in order to tell Renzo Piano to finally cut 50 meters lower his tower, so that it will be 1 meter lower than the Mole Antonelliana. And as an outcome, basically, the building, which in the meantime suffered from the real estate bubble from 2008, it was now built partially in concrete, reinforced concrete, partially in steel. It's a bulky, ugly skyscraper that doesn't look at all like the first render. which doesn't host all the offices, all the office space that was intended to host in the very first time. And so now Torino has an ugly skyscraper, badly built, and very chunky and not as slender as it was supposed to be. And Intesa San Paolo doesn't have the amount of office space they needed, all thanks to the protests, which were moved all by this super small image. So this was the point I wanted to make in a conclusion. Just to say that, yes, it's not only Civitas and Urbs which make the city, which are connected, but actually Civitas, Urbs, and Imago, the three of them make the city. And it is designing the three of them that we do produce the city today. Thank you very much, and sorry if it took so long.
It's perfect. You didn't took so much time to finish, so
Super.
thank you. I think this last part was actually very useful. So thank you so much. Yeah, a lot of things, also a lot of issues that can be discussed in common between the two presentations. I think that many things Davide said resonated so much with our previous lectures as well. So I'm happy because I think that the students have met another way of seeing many topics that we already tackled, found images and names that already know. So now maybe there are already some comments and some comments by the students. Maybe, okay, Camillo, I was reading your things, and in a way, I think Davide was answering to your second comment without maybe even reading it when he talked about systems for the wind noise, for the wind in the skyscrapers. Anyway, if you want to. Okay, maybe we can give the floor first of all to Claudia, and so then everybody can talk and maybe raise their hands. Because Camilo, if you want to talk to explain your points, and also Dinesh, you can maybe read yourself your comments or maybe tell yourself your comments. But first of all, Claudia.
Okay. As you prefer, huh? I mean, I can, yeah, okay.
The comments are there, so we
Okay,
will
great.
pick up.
Well, actually, there would be many things I would like to ask. So I start with the first one, then to give space to the others. Well, actually, thanks a lot. Was really like indeed like super interesting. Both the presentations. And let's say that even like both following your presentation as well as by reading and going through your books, let's say that it was kind of natural for me to create sort of continuous comparison, let's say, between your works. Of course, let's say that your different backgrounds in a way highlight two diverse perspectives through which the image is approached. On one side, the one, of course, of an artist and researcher who produced theory on the images, and on the other, the one of a photographer who actually creates the images themselves. Yet there are many aspects that I felt as, let's say, to be common. Well, I'll try to mention two, also in relation to probably what you show, especially today, which is on one side the idea of conceiving, in fact, the imagery as something that absorbs specific conditions, which are always, let's say, very personal. So basically, in other words, you both seems to rightly put attention on the need of awareness towards the subjectiveness that they imply. But then on the other side, something that seems to be central to both of you is, and that also, let's say, intrigues me a lot, is the political dimension that they embed. I'll try to be very short, but like more specifically, if Michele questions, let's say, a stereotype image made up of icons, so trying to highlight a social dimension that is often hidden, Davide seems, especially when he refers to ad hoc images, let's say that clearly references the impossibility of neutrality, stating that by, even in the book, he says that by their nature, they are always political facts, whose, of course, meanings change and adapts in time. Till the point, in fact, of reaching a commercial intent and, as you say, becoming tools for financial expansion. So this said, let's say, I will be interested if you kind of could articulate your position on this specific aspect, so the political role of the image, but also trying to put the true works, so not just to reflect on yours, but also to reflect on the other, trying to put them in tension. So probably trying to reflect what you think could be, let's say, what they could, in a way, like state and let emerge through different media. Yeah. Sorry, it was a bit long, but I hope it was kind of clear.
Yeah, if I can add something more to your question, Claudia, since it's something that I also wanted to focus on, is that in fact, in Davide's book at the end, in the final chapter, that is the chapter about which maybe today, that you sacrificed a little bit more today, but you added a brand new part, so I'm happy about it. But anyway, you articulate a lot about these two poles of the political role of the image. On one side, its role in a kind of be a support to commodification of the city, of commodification processes. And on the other side, at the end of the chapter, you praise that actually the image can also play a different role in triggering, let's say, processes of different nature, social participation, of belonging, of appropriation, etc. So in a way, as it is a sort of, the images being so crucially important in the perception, understanding of our cities, has become to be the real, let's say, political arena, we can maybe call them, on which we can be able to discuss or to make the difference about the future of our cities. And that is something that is also, I think, as Claudia said, embedded in Michele's work, because I was taking note of the first concept that you, Miki, began with in your lecture, about the fact that you were trying to fill a void of representation, and this void was something that talked about a political, also, let's say, a void of civitas, to put it in the words through the categories that Davide introduced in his lecture. Let's say, as in the images that are usually spread about these places, there is not, the society is completely lacking. Maybe in a way, the civitas is actually lacking from these cities, but in the images, let's say, it is maybe a product of a wrong way to look at them, or of anyway, maybe I'm confusing a little bit, but that's the point. I wanted to add this reflections on Claudia's question, because I think they are more or less related. But you who wants to begin? Now you are.
Michele, vai tu?
Come vuoi.
Vai.
Yes, in the order. Make it talk first. So.
Well, I don't know exactly how to answer, because I'm here as a photographer, so I want to stay on my role. And so I think the first important thing I can add is that the political dimension is always related to the image, and to the personal dimension, to the personal point of view that one has. So there is this impossibility to think of images in abstract terms. So, for example, one of the one of the things I do is in my work is always to reflect on why some images and some subjects look so interesting to me in images. I started a long-term research on iconic architecture because I like it, because it affects my imagination, because it's something I both find nasty and fantastic. So I think one issue is to be really fair and really honest with ourselves. So we really have to think why we like or we dislike some images rather than others, and try to think why some views, in this case urban views, are so sexy, and why they work so much on the common imagination, why they are so functional. And so I think being aware of how images are built and conceived and why they are oriented, many times they are from the beginning, they are conceived for a specific reason. It's also a political act, because you become aware that there is a whole system of power, actually, since the beginning of the times, which is based on who is able to craft the images and use them. So one thing that is very interesting in the book that I've read by Davide is the fact that he states that in the past, the people that were able to create and manage the imagery of places was a small part of the population. So it was only in the hands of a few persons compared to the global population. But now this has changed, and so the image of the city, the image of architecture, is divided into many different actors. And I think this is very important. So, of course, there are several interests in the images, because the images can be used in many different ways, and they can be built in many different ways for many different reasons. So, what else? If you want to add something, Davide, maybe I will,
Yeah, sure. I mean,
and make a dialogue.
basically, you also gave my answer because you mentioned this little part of the book which I didn't really explain well today. I really think I should, for the next conference, I will completely delete the first half, which is this academic part, which I still keep on my back to show that I did a PhD about these things. But then I should really start from the second and enrich it with more sexy and let's say contemporary examples. Anyway, next time. Yes, indeed.
It was useful to root it in the course, actually, for me.
Okay.
To root it in the discourse and to give theoretical.
I had the feeling it was a bit long, so maybe next time I'll try to. I don't know how to cut it because I already cut it as much as I could.
Okay, I know what I want, what you want. Next time I'll give you 2 hours.
Thank you. You're really doing a favor. So I also speak slowly. I mean, I don't know how to speak slowly. Anyway, no, but like, okay, let's try to ask this question. Who makes us see what we see? Because the point is that the images that come to us are produced, and people who produce images with intentions, and what are the intentions of those who produce these images. What I liked very much of Michele's photographies, for example, is that suddenly, as he very well explained, some of the political fragile layers that allow Dubai to exist as a city, both as a urbs, as a civitas, and as an imago, suddenly get revealed. I mean, we know very well that there's an amount of basically slave workers who get their passports taken away as soon as they reach the United Emirates, and they have to work for really low wages, and they basically have no option to leave these places and so on and so forth. We know about the deaths on the building sites. We know all these kind of things. But one thing is to know something by reading it, and one thing is to see an image, which in a very elegant and delicate way, I have to say. You said you didn't want to make a super strong, or you couldn't, I don't know, make super strong somehow almost journalistic report statements, but the way in which you tell the story of those who build Dubai, to me, was really, really, really on point and extremely clear. So the point is that this is clearly not the image that the owners of these buildings want to give of the city. One thing that I don't know how to say anymore is we all have in mind another kind of Dubai, because I don't know who we are, in the sense that precisely because now the production of images is so differentiated, and also the reception and the channels through which images travel are so multiple, that I don't recognize myself into a we anymore, or at least a global we or a collective we. There's many communities which receive certain images and discuss about them, which is one of the fantastic things that are happening today. So we are discussing about the fantastic pictures by Michele, for example. So we generate our own understandings of the world through these discussions and these conversations, which happen thanks to the fact that we have access to certain channels, which could be or not be academic. That doesn't really matter. So first of all, I have to say I'm always in trouble when I have to identify some like larger or almost all-encompassing community of people who all share the same imaginary, because I don't know if there exists a collective imaginary anymore, if collective really is collective where everybody is part of the collective. On the other hand, it is true that the kind of images that are shown by these real estate companies are images which speak of a very specific kind of society. This, of course, a neoliberal, global capitalist society of smart workers in maybe ICT sectors who spend apparently. I haven't shown any video. I could have. It's one of the funny things of my long lecture. There's videos which promote these real estate interventions in New York, London, and so on, where you see the lifestyle of these people that I showed you only in these pictures, you see these women with a glass of wine and the dog. Then you also have videos speaking of their everyday life. So they basically go to have a coffee in this fantastic Starbucks, and then they go to have shopping, and then they have a nice lunch in a terrace, and they go to do some more shopping, then they go to a concert, they go to dinner, they go to sleep, but they never work. Like, what is this society that is being somehow promoted and built up? What kind of imaginary are we being given by these real estate companies? And this is the point that I wanted to make, that basically who makes us see what we see? So are we really seeing things as we are told we should see them, or are we capable of constantly questioning what lies behind these images that we are giving? My great fear, as I said during my presentation, was that urban landscape is understood as something which is purely representational, purely aesthetical, purely a matter of surface. So really looking beyond the image and looking at all the network, the economic, political, social, cultural network that makes these images possible, is something that I find more and more fundamental. In the end, this network would never exist without images that represent it and that mediate this network to us. So an image is always there, but what makes this image possible, I think, is the kind of question we should always ask. And then, yes, we can also produce images today and make them circulate at a global scale, which of course makes everything much more interesting in a way. And this is why I claim for the politicality of images today, because it's almost a democratic tool. Like everybody can by now produce images which circulate and in the end could potentially trigger social activism. So yeah, I don't know if I answered correctly correctly enough the observations.
Well, there would be something else I would like to answer, actually, to keep going with on this, but I don't know, Gaia, if you want first to give the stage to students as you prefer, since I'm seeing there are quite some questions.
Maybe we can just go through because I don't see hands raised, but we can just read the comments. or ask them if they want to take the word directly. Camillo, would you like to talk? You can switch on the cameras, guys. Or would you prefer me to read your comments? You can just speak.
Hi, I can speak for a while. My comment was about, yes, the how the image, especially in the commercial sector, is like trying to sell a product or trying to sell a lifestyle, very pinpointed at exactly what a target audience wants. I speak of this and I find this really interesting because I was on the side of producing the image. I was in Colombia for a while working in real estate, and we did the renderings and we did the ambience and we thought about how people like to be in these places, or what do we put into the photo montage to make them trigger some kind of feeling and then to buy. So also complimenting later in a comment of Alejandro on how this kind of blue tinted glasses in the skyscraper are doing a fake feeling of the sky. I think, and also we mentioned in previous classes that there will be an upcoming realm of virtuality in which I feel like not every one of us can live in a, or will be able to live in a super billionaire complex. But now we have these virtual worlds in which we can personalize or we can enter to some sort of feeling of these images of super rich furnishing or super beautiful landscape. So in a sense, I feel like technology and architecture and images and urban images are starting to blur and merge into each other. Especially, I don't know if you have seen, for example, Mark Zuckerberg metaverse publicity, in which he intends that to merge the real world with the virtual world. And everything that this is going to happen soon enough. I think there are many movies and reference where we can see this. So in general, the lecture I find really interesting and really appreciate. And the pictures that we saw about Dubai is something that, what for me, what happens in Dubai is something really outrageous about hyper-capitalism and something that it's the physical world, but also it's uncontrolled world. I think that even if there are positive aspects, I mean, the picture of the people watching the skyline is kind of, for me, it evokes like is this the product of mankind in this late century. So, but I don't know if this product is positive or negative, or but it is there, no? So yeah, just mentioning this kind of also thing, and I think that's it.
Maybe if you allow me, Michele, I just I have one comment to make regarding the, since you mentioned the metaverse, I'm very much aware of what's going on. It's one of my themes that I'm very interested in following, is precisely this digitalization of our, let's say, experience of the world. I mean, I'm interested in the way in which we are mediated, or in which we mediate our territories. So of course, social media and now, let's say, virtual reality are ways of mediating between us and what surrounds us. Of course, I follow the presentation of Zuckerberg and so on. My only observation regarding what you said is that your observation is linked to an idea that virtual space is a space where scarcity doesn't exist. You know that capitalism is based on scarcity, in the sense that not everyone can have access to all goods, and this is what makes the goods valuable and so on. Since Zuckerberg Metaverse is clearly a project of a new kind of scarcity, in the sense that he clearly addresses the metaverse as a new space where to reinstall the exact same kind of commercial and economic relationship that exists outside of the metaverse. I can imagine that new kind of scarcities will be invented, which we don't know yet. Therefore, maybe having the virtual experience of a high tower in New York won't be at all exciting in itself or something that people will want, but they will want this other thing which they cannot afford because there's this new scarcity which has been produced. So I simply wouldn't be that optimistic. For what I see, the metaverse is just another commercial space coming out, a super interesting one to investigate, but a completely private space, as a matter of fact. And so we have to be very careful when about what we are expecting Facebook and all these other huge companies to deliver to us, whatever the virtual realm in the future will be.
Can I add one thing?
Of course.
I'd like to answer regarding the first thing you said. So the fact that you have been working on visualization in Colombia. I think that's an interesting point because, of course, I am in the same position of being, let's say, trying to be independent or to have a personal view and to give a different side of places like Dubai or Abu Dhabi, etc. But I'm also one of the ones that make the promotional imagery when I'm called by architects because they want another kind of job done. And without those kinds of commissions, I wouldn't be able to travel to these places and create my series that I showed today in the presentation. So it's the word in general, it's quite complex and ambiguous, and I recommend not to be to avoid any moralistic approach to imagery and to be very careful when you judge one situation or something you see, because things always have different meanings. Of course, I don't want to, to excuse everything bad in the world. Of course, there are many bad things going on. And I mean, I think that David has shown a series of examples that are good, good in explaining that images can have certain effects and certain side effects in the long term. So my recommendation is to, to look carefully, to look for a long time before giving a judgment on something because it's the only way. For example, it took me 10 years to make this book. I would never be able to do it in 2 years or in 3 years because I spent most of the time not taking pictures, but thinking about and studying and participating to researches within the academia and without. And that's the only way to to make an imagery which is also conscious, which is which has different layers of understanding of how reality is. And the other thing is that it happens that you are on different sides or that you are asked to do something you don't feel like it's your favorite thing or it's not for you. So it's also a matter of being yourself. So, taking a part. So if you want to be, just a mechanism, like a technique of image of, a good technician that is able to produce images for someone, or you want to be a person that has a personal thought, a pure personal view, and he is able to, to keep close to this view, because small choices are often the most important. In everyday life, you will have, as an architect now, as a student, to take your steps and to make decisions regarding which kind of images you want to believe in and you want to create. For photography, is the same, because of course, every time we shoot a building like the Burj Khalifa or some iconic project, and then we post it online, we reinforce the strong image of this place. So we have we're doing something apparently very light and without problems, but in the end, it accumulates and it has some consequences.
You have a responsibility.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
May I? Oh, sorry.
Hi, Claudia.
Yeah, there will be something like that I would like to add when we were speaking, when we mentioned the fact of the process of digitalization, because yeah, I mean, this opened up a bit a reflection to me, and in a sense that I completely agree with Davide about the fact that indeed, like the images are per se instruments of mediation, able to embed many layers, to encapsulate many meanings. And that, of course, like the process of digitalization, the hyperconnection, in a way, because in a way, like it broke the geographical boundaries, and so it created a sort of democratization. On the other side, one thing I kind of, let's say, perceive in a way, I believe is that the bad side probably of that is that the communities which let's say could be indeed somehow recognizable through the images, through these hyperconnections, are somehow flattened. So let's say like more on a stylistic level, these things kind of create a sort of stylistic flattening in a way. So I mean, in the way that sometimes you can't recognize what comes first and what comes after, in a way also killing, I want to say, like the authorship, which is also maybe a good thing. But there will be like probably more like speaking about architectural images more than photographic, or maybe that is my feeling because it's the one that I know the best. But I don't know. I mean, I just want to make this reflection also in reaction to what you were saying. I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
If I can say something about this, Claudia, I think I can relate to what you are saying, knowing your background, knowing the work you do, and knowing the people you know, and so on and so forth. And maybe I can imagine the kind of images that you are relating to, but as a matter of fact, there's, let's say that maybe if during the 20th century, I mean, since architecture became a mass medium, so let's say since the 20th century, probably there's always been this sort of flattening that you speak about. The only difference is probably that we have now several flattenings which coexist at the very same time, while before, at least until the 1960s, there was only like one possible flattening, which was the flattening of the modern architecture, international style, and so on, probably. But really, it's I have the feeling that it's really simply a matter of finding the different sources of knowledge, in the sense that maybe certain phenomena are, in terms of quantity, more relevant. And usually the phenomena that are in terms of quantity more relevant are not always as relevant in terms of quality. And the phenomena which is relevant in terms of quality are usually smaller. So we kind of have one of the tasks that we have in order to not settle on this flattened imagery that we are surrounded by, is to constantly keep looking for diversity, for progressive imagery, for unexpectedness, for things which are there somewhere in the web. To me, at least, I think there's always something which surprises me. You just have to really look a lot for it. So I don't, if you're talking about architecture and you're talking about the flattening of certain architectural imagery, I for sure see it as a constant in the last 100 and something years. But I'm pretty sure that now we have access to much more imagery than before. So I don't know if I answered correctly because also you put the question in a vague, like a bit foggy way. So I was
Yeah,
really
of
trying
course, I
to
didn't
put
know, but
myself.
actually it's also like probably a huge conversation like per se. So yeah, I didn't want to, but yes, let's say like in general, like let's say the role of the, or let's say the action of the image in such like hyper-connected world, for sure, it's something that you kind of depicted, and it's something that's probably somehow, let's say, intertwine different kind of, let's say, layers, how to say, and probably, yeah.
I'll try to say one thing. Globalization, by definition, is always a process that is basically jumping between local and global. Globalization
sure.
is something always global that doesn't exist because globalization needs locality in order to differentiate itself, because Paris doesn't want to look like London, which doesn't want to look like Milan, because if they all look alike, then basically also the economic entries from tourism, for example, would make no sense anymore. So they, of course, the globalization. There was this sociologist whose name I don't remember anymore, who clearly said that the globalization is a phenomenon of localization in globalization. So already this makes an argument for, or I would say against complete flattening. So to me, the image that the Colas was showing in the in his Biennale, where before, like the national architecture, they were all different, and now national architecture are all the same. To me, it's a little bit untrue, in the sense that it is probably true for the past century or second half of the past century, but now I see things going in a much more complex and different way. We are not necessarily really making local architecture anymore, but it's very hard to imagine that there's only one thing happening and everybody's starting to design or imaging or produce images which all look like the same. I find it's a more dialectics, I would say. It's inevitable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Definitely. I was like more speaking about like a more like stylistic kind of view. Of course, this can't be generalized, but in a way, now I'm kind of provoking, of course. But if through Instagram, Pinterest, more Instagram, everyone can feel like a photographer, and they look which are the coolest photos and which are the ones that get you the more amount of likes. Then where is the average of having your personal and your kind of, let's say, characteristic and kind of, how to say, this, let's say, all this, I want to say, but let's say in there, you kind of perceive a sort of aesthetic flattening, you know, like in that I was like more probably banalizing in a way, but that is something I wanted to state, of course, probably also changing a bit perspective to what you were referring before. It was like more a general in a way.
The aesthetic of Instagram, basically, the language of
In a
Instagram.
way, yes. I feel that it's a sort of airspace or a sort of like aesthetic per se, which somehow one feel like kind of align to, and but anyway, this is something that can maybe.
I would really love to know what Michele thinks of Instagram, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, me too. We talked a lot with the students also in the previous lectures about this say how the high, let's say, view from the photographer, the author, the cultivated view, the cultivated gaze interact with the huge baggage of images that everybody can produce.
My view is generally positive. I think that photography is in a moment of very good shape. Also technically, because cell phones are smartphones are great cameras, especially in the last few years. The thing is always to distinguish, make some distinctions, because of course Instagram has got some rules which are deriving from the technical facts and by how our brain relates to a small screen showing images. So I'm also a journalist, so I've been to a course of Instagram for journalists a couple of years ago, and I was told that the images in Instagram that takes more that get more likes are the ones showing a lot of blue or a lot of blue with some red. That means sky, sunset, and sea. So, for example, I mean, and this is a fact. It's just a statistics. It's not an interpretation. It's the fact that certain kind of brain stimulations get more likes. So this is one thing you cannot forget when you use Instagram. And also, I touched it with my, firsthand in my experience, because I've been posting some of these images, the ones I showed this afternoon, but in general, all the times that I post one of my images in Instagram, I get a certain amount of likes. If I post an image of beer bottles into a fountains in the mountain and I write, oh, this is the beginning of summer, I get 3 times more the likes of my post. So I think it's good. I like Instagram because it helps me, and I agree with what David says, that the availability of different images now, it's something amazing. Because with Instagram, you can really get access to different ways of looking at reality, because you can really go into some other people's lives. And this is really something that still amazes me very much. But at the same time, it's also true that you have to be, to be aware of what you're looking at, because most of the things you see are just, not very interesting, and it's just an accumulation of average stuff. The other thing is that the potential of Instagram is that it's showing architecture in use. So I like the fact that you can see buildings and projects all over the years, and also inhabited and used by different people in different ways. There are different interpretations. So I think this is also a potential, because the problem with most of the architectural projects is that we see them only through the eyes of a very strongly codified way of photographing them and publishing them. Yeah. So it's interesting to integrate these 2 different visions. One is the one produced by the official media, which is generally very promotional. And one is the one coming from the people, which of course, it's not neutral, it's not naive, because there are cultural filters. There is the technical fact that Instagram works in a certain way, but it's still something which is really different, and it's really free compared to the mono vision of the photographer, of the
Also
official
YouTube.
photographer.
No, also YouTube.
That's another chapter. But for example, a few years ago, some Dutch offices like OMA and VLTV started to integrate in their websites a selection of pictures taken from feeds, Instagram feeds. And I think that was great. I mean, because you could see a variety of different ways of looking at architecture. In general, of course, they selected the ones that were giving a positive image, but at least it was an expansion of the imagery. And I think this is a very positive thing.
When I was mentioning YouTube, Michela was mentioning the fact that going back to Dubai, I actually visited almost all of the pavilions in Dubai without moving from my house, because there were now people who there are people who go to the expo and they shoot not pictures, but they really walkthroughs in all the pavilions that they visit. So you could see the one with the project by Christian Keretz, the one from Spain, and so on and so forth. And that's when I had the, as if I needed it, the confirmation of the fact that you are a very good photographer, because I also saw the Italian pavilion by Rattinrota from the eye of someone who simply walked through it. And you made fantastic photographs of it, which really made me wonder, oh, Jesus Christ, am I so wrong in criticizing it as an architecture? And then I saw the videos and I thought, okay, now I get a different view of that. And I started to, let's say, have a more complex image of that.
Yeah, that's a good point, I think, because I really had this tough experience at the inauguration of the expo, because the pavilion, it's very experimental, and it doesn't respond to any stable or already viewed image of a building or a pavilion. So it's very strange. It looks strange in photography, and I had to work a lot to find the right way to show its qualities, because it has great qualities in terms of the spaces that the architects built, especially inside. So in a way, since I took also some small videos for the architectural offices, I thought that in some ways the only way to represent, for example, the movement of the ropes in the facade and some of the animations, the fact that all this is reacting to the wind, it's something that you can achieve only through video. So I think, photography has some limits. It's something you cannot avoid, to have strong limitations, and I think it was really bad to see just one shot, all tilted of the pavilion, so it looked like a barrack, and bad comments on it. That was an easy way to. A bad way to consider something which is, on the contrary, very interesting. And I think it was a good, opportunity to do this kind of experiment into an expo rather than into a building that has to stay there forever. So I
have the doubt that you are a little too generous with the pavilion, but anyway, maybe I will document myself a little bit more.
Well, I haven't said I think it's the best building in the world. I just say that through photography you can make different discourses, and that also the photographers need to to find out, and they are challenged by some kinds of experiments made by architects. So if you don't take the challenge, it's your problem.
But I totally agree with you, Michele, that images polarize attention and reaction. Even if there's only one simple image that people don't even understand and question, they start to comment on it, and they can have there can be rage, there can be trolling, and so on and so forth. So I find it very interesting. This really happens so much with the image of architecture. Somehow the architectural images and images of cities trigger behaviors online which show the potential precisely of this sort of imagery. It's a kind of behavior that I'm not sure would be generated by some other kind, or maybe it is, I don't know. I should make I always wondered if the behavior of the architectural community is the same online as the behavior, like, I don't know, the design community or the literary community. I have no idea. I would really wonder to see if there's any, because we behave strangely online. But I agree that just like these images are given out to be experienced often superficially, the superficial experience is what a lot of public gives back. So again, really taking the time to look at what the images are really saying and what are the buildings behind the images and so on is a necessary let's say process, especially today. I totally agree. There was a lot of superficial comments indeed.
Guys, if I may, we have still maximum 10 minutes. Unfortunately, it's my fault because I have another seminar after. So I would like maybe to give the possibility to the students to say something if they want to add something, like Dinesh or Alejandro or other people would like to add comments or ask questions? Right now or never? Dinesh, Alejandro, or you just made your points in the chat?
Yeah, I think we already talked about
Okay.
this virtual world, so I think the topic is already
Nice.
discussed. Thank you so much anyway.
Thanks. Guys, there's nobody else who would like to add something or ask something? I tell it because maybe then you have the great idea, but it's too late. Okay, no.
Maybe I can close a little bit, coming back to the first intervention and the answers, and I agree totally with Michele that of course one can be just the tool that makes the images, but also especially in Colombia, or in my personal experience, sometimes the images or the image told such a powerful story, or a commercial ambience or something that the people buy with this strong feeling, that eventually the architecture has to cope with what you offer. And in my office, they were very afraid of this feeling, and I guess it's everywhere in the world, that if you produce something, you have to commit to do it. And this can lead, of course, to compromises, but of course to maybe at the end a better architecture. So if we think about it, yes, I think that in general, urban imaginary and digital image can show, or they show, a specific intention. But this intention, as Michele said, it can be as you want it to be. Just saying that I understand the point that you are that you give to me back in your comment. And also to say everyone that I really appreciated this seminar, and it's really an amazing work. And I have actually not read your books, but I'm pretty interested in doing so. So thank you for this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Camilo. Thanks. Claudia, if you want to close,
Yeah.
the last statement, I leave the floor to you, and then we close.
Okay. Well, yeah, no, I think that's indeed with this last, let's say, exchange, we kind of, I mean, I feel sorry for maybe first, I mean, before I didn't explain myself immediately, but I think at the end we were kind of saying the same with actually this the role of this of the digital also images, and the fact that of course there is on one side the fact of, like, especially through Instagram, being able to perceive these different perspectives. On the other side, probably specifically speaking about, I don't know, a community, it's kind of inevitable, the fact of kind of feeling an alignment. But it's true, definitely, that this richness have been increased a lot. So, well, what to say? Apart from the fact that I think was really great and rich, was 2 or 3 actually, not 2, 3 amazing hours together, and I think that's again, I'm even more convinced about, let's say, the common and shared, let's say, elements between, or visions, points of connection between the 2 works. That kind of like help us like digging into the topic even more. Were also great the questions by the students, so I think was I really enjoyed that. I hope was the same for you. I don't know if you have anything to add. Otherwise, well, for me actually, I'm very much satisfied and happy about what has been discussed.
Me too. Of course, we can go on talking for forever. Let's say that
Yeah.
there would be, if we had another 2 hours, I would have many questions, but maybe it's
And some beers, possibly.
and some beers and questions with the beers.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, of course. But if let's say now we don't have time anymore, because if we raise other topics right now, it would be completely out of time. So what to say? Thank you so much to the three of you. Yes, I also think that actually what is the intuition of putting together these two works has worked. I think that also for you was interesting to meet each other and to dialogue. And yes, I'm very happy that we had the opportunity to, let's say, yeah, to for this seminar has been a really perfect conclusion for the discourses that we have trying to deal with during our last lectures, and I think that have made a point, have enriched a lot the discussion, and I'm very happy. So thank you so much. And I think that's the same for the students that show that appreciate it very much and have been very interested in your works and presentations. So guys,
Thank you, Gaia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Claudia, have a good flight. I don't know where you need to go, but I know that the flight is 7 o'clock.
Yes, soon. I will soon.
So okay, don't lose your flight, please.
No.
And next time, next time we will organize something in presence, I hope.
Let's
Okay.
cross fingers.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao, guys.
Thank you.
Michele, ciao.
Very
Ciao.
much.
Ciao,
Thank you
Nina.
so much.
Ciao, ciao, ciao.
Bye, thanks.
Ciao.